They say trust is the foundation of any relationship, but what happens when that foundation starts to crack? For me, it began with the late nights. Lisa, my girlfriend of 3 years, had started working longer hours. At least that's what she claimed. Big project, she'd say, kicking off her heels at the door. At first, I didn't question it. I'd make her dinner, ask how her day was, and let her vent about her so-called deadlines. But over time, her excuses stopped making sense. It wasn't just the hours. It was her whole demeanor. She stopped laughing at my dumb jokes. Conversations became shorter, and her phone became a permanent fixture in her hand. She was always texting, smiling at the screen like the outside world didn't exist. I noticed the name Mike popping up more and more, but every time I asked about him, her answer was the same. He's just a coworker. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Call it paranoia, call it instinct, but it ate at me. One night, while we were watching TV, her phone buzzed again. She reached for it so quickly that she nearly knocked over her wine glass. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Mike," she said, not even looking up. There it was again. Mike, the guy I'd never met but was apparently the most important person in her life these days. "You guys seem close," I said, my voice tinged with something I couldn't quite mask. She shot me a look. "We work together. Don't make it weird." I wanted to drop it, but the way she said it, like I was the problem, only made my suspicions grow. A week later, she told me she was meeting her sister for dinner. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but her sister had texted me earlier that day, asking how Lisa was doing because they hadn't talked in weeks. Something didn't add up. That night, I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous, like I was in some low-budget detective movie, but I couldn't help myself. I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and tailed her car through the city. My hands were sweating on the wheel, my heart pounding like I was committing a crime. She pulled up to a bar downtown, the kind of place where people go to disappear. I parked a block away and walked over, my stomach in knots. Through the window, I saw her sitting at a table with a guy. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in a cologne ad. He leaned in close and she laughed, tucking her hair behind her ear. I stood there, frozen. The world around me blurred as I watched them. Her laugh, her smile, the way she tilted her head, all of it was so familiar, but none of it was meant for me. I didn't think. I walked inside, my steps heavy, my chest tight. She saw me before I reached their table. Her face went pale and she jumped up, nearly knocking over her drink. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I ignored her and looked at the guy. "So this is Mike?" He looked confused, glancing between us like he didn't understand what was happening. Yeah. Who are you?" "I'm her boyfriend," I said, my voice colder than I intended. Lisa grabbed my arm, trying to pull me away. "We're just having drinks. It's not what it looks like." I shook her off. "Funny, you said you were meeting your sister." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her guilt written all over her face. I didn't wait for an explanation. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, calling after me. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I crashed at my friend Tom's place, pacing his living room while he tried to calm me down. "Maybe it's nothing," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. The next morning, after barely any sleep, I decided I needed answers. I found Mike on social media and messaged him. To my surprise, he agreed to meet. I went in ready for a fight, but when I told him about Lisa, he looked genuinely confused. "Wait, what?" he said, pushing his coffee aside. She's been talking to me, but not like that." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "She's been venting about your brother." It felt like the ground beneath me shifted. "My brother?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Mike nodded, looking uncomfortable. "I don't know much, man. She just mentioned feeling closer to him lately." "I thought you knew." I didn't wait for him to finish. I left the cafe and drove straight to my brother's apartment. My hands were shaking on the wheel, adrenaline and anger coursing through me. When he opened the door, shirtless and rubbing his eyes, I knew. "You tell me," I said, stepping inside and slamming the door shut behind me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and that was all the confirmation I needed. "You're acting crazy," my brother Jake said, backing up a step like I might actually hit him. "Crazy?" I repeated, my voice rising. You're sleeping with my girlfriend and I'm the crazy one? Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like this was just another one of my overreactions. That casual, dismissive attitude was what finally made me snap. I lunged at him, shoving him against the wall so hard that a picture frame crashed to the floor. "Tell me the truth," I shouted, my fists clenched so tightly that my arms trembled. "How long has this been going on?" "For God's sake, Aaron, calm down," he barked, shoving me off him. "It's not what you think." "Oh, really? So you didn't hook up with Lisa behind my back?" His silence was all the answer I needed. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. I laughed bitterly, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief more than anything else. "You're my brother, Jake. How could you do this to me? It just happened, okay?" He snapped, his voice cracking. "She came to me. She was upset, saying you were distant and didn't care anymore." I stared at him, my chest heaving. "So, what, you decided to console her in bed?" "It wasn't like that," he shot back. "She needed someone to talk to, and it just got out of hand." "Got out of hand?" I repeated, my voice dripping with venom. "You destroyed everything for what, Jake? A fling? Some cheap thrill?" He opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, like he couldn't even justify his actions to himself. That made it worse. I turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind me so hard that I heard something else fall inside. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't go back home. Not yet. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I pulled into the parking lot of a diner that I realized I hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. Inside, I ordered coffee and stared at the cup like it held the answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. My phone buzzed on the table and I saw Lisa's name flash on the screen. I let it ring. She called again, then again. Finally, I answered, my voice colder than I thought it could be. "What do you want?" "Aaron, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. "Please, just come home." "Home?" I scoffed. "You mean the place where you've been lying to my face for weeks?" "Hard pass. It's not that simple," she pleaded. "I never meant for this to happen." "Then explain it to me," I said, my voice rising. "How do you accidentally cheat on someone? How do you accidentally hook up with their brother?" She didn't have an answer, just silence. "I can't do this, Lisa," I said finally, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "You and Jake, you've ruined everything." "Aaron, please," she started, but I hung up before she could finish. The next few days were a blur of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I told myself I didn't need closure, but part of me couldn't let it go. I didn't want to face either of them, but I knew I couldn't move on without answers. So a week later, I showed up at her apartment. She opened the door, her eyes red and puffy like she hadn't slept either. "Aaron," she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't sit. I didn't even take off my jacket. "I just want to know why," I said, crossing my arms. She sat down on the couch, wringing her hands like she was trying to squeeze the guilt out of them. "I was lonely," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so distant lately. I felt like you didn't care anymore." "Distant?" I repeated, incredulous. "Lisa, I've been working extra hours to save for our future. I've been doing everything I can for us, and you call that distant?" She looked down, tears streaming down her face. I know it's not an excuse. Jake was there, and he listened, and..." "And what?" I interrupted. "You decided that was worth throwing everything away for?" She didn't answer. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, wondering how we got here. Finally, I shook my head and turned toward the door. "I'm done, Lisa," I said without looking back. "I can't forgive this. Either of you." As I walked out, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with the pain. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the constant questioning, it was all over. That night, I blocked both their numbers and started packing my things. It wasn't easy, but I knew staying would only make things worse. I found a small apartment on the other side of town and threw myself into work, determined to rebuild my life piece by piece. Months later, I heard through a mutual friend that Lisa and Jake didn't last. Apparently, the guilt tore them apart. It didn't bring me any satisfaction, though. By then, I had already started to heal. Looking back, I realized their betrayal wasn't about me. It was about their own flaws, their own insecurities. I couldn't control what they did, but I could control how I moved forward.